And then I'm going to speak to the Trilateral Commission in Slovenia, in Ljubljanka.
How big is it? How many people physically belong to the Trilateral Commission?
When we first started it, and let me repeat again so the viewers will know what we're talking about, it's an American, North American, Western European, Japanese organization to promote closer contacts between these three regions of the world. And the commission is composed of private citizens, not government officials, who are leaders in the different sectors of society.
For a while now, some of us who have been paying attention have noticed that Peterson is beyond a shadow of a doubt, a globalist shill with a blatantly anti-white agenda.
People in Europe who are turning to a regressive nationalism as an alternative to the current state of chaos.
I mean, he worked at the United Nations for 3 years, drafting Marxist one-world government white papers. He worked for a guy named Jim Balsillie, who was the former CEO of Research in Motion, the Canadian company that invented the BlackBerry. And Jim Balsillie is literally George Soros' protege. Balsillie and Soros co-founded the INET Globalist think tank together, a think tank that just so happens to employ Eric Weinstein as an official expert, the guy who created the intellectual dark web that has been shilling Peterson and a variety of other anti-white schlubs that have been masquerading as radical centrists in an attempt to cement the Overton window firmly just to the left of center. So Peterson, of course, doesn't deny that he worked at the UN. He's quite proud of the fact that he worked there.
I worked on the UN Secretary General's High Panel for Sustainability, the report that was delivered in, I believe, 2013, and rewrote the underlying narrative to strip out most of the ideological claptrap.
However, he often brings up his time at the UN and sort of tries to do this half-assed kind of criticism of the report that he spent 3 years of his life working on.
When I was working for a UN panel on economic sustainability, for the Secretary General, the original narrative was extremely pessimistic. It detailed how we were despoiling the planet and how everything was getting worse and how we were at each other's throats. And
he always criticizes the report for being overly pessimistic about the state of the Earth's environment. And, much of this report is about how climate change and humans affecting the environment are just devastating the planet so much that the United Nations now needs to step in and begin managing how different countries are interacting with the environment and with each other. What's really telling, though, is what Peterson doesn't talk about when he brings up his time working at the United Nations, what he doesn't mention about the paper he worked on. To my knowledge, he has never addressed some of the really scary things that are in this paper, such as the fact that it's literally a Marxist, communist, one-world government blueprint that talks about how the United Nations now needs to step in to create equity inside of nations between all people, so equality of outcome, and equity between nations. So, for example, between first world nations and third world nations. So this is Marxist wealth transfer, socialist redistribution stuff on a global scale. Yet Jordan Peterson has never criticized this work that he has done in that regard. He just talks about how, they're a little too pessimistic about the environment. Peterson claims that he rewrote this entire document to, quote, strip it of the underlying ideological claptrap. And think about it, what does that actually mean? I mean, the paper still says what it says, but if he's removing the ideological claptrap, as he says, it sounds like they paid him to mask the language in the document so it was less overtly Marxist. One of the things this document mentions a few times is creating equity between different countries. It says here on page 13, equity needs to be at the forefront. Developing countries need time, as well as financial and technological support to transition to sustainable development. And then it says, we must empower all of society, especially women, young people, the unemployed, the most vulnerable, the weakest sections of society. I mean, this is pure Marxism. This is all about lifting up the oppressed classes and creating social equity for them. Since it's the UN, I mean, it even says like they're focused on accomplishing this in every single country on Earth. And then here on page 25, some more stuff about equity. In spite of some improvements in social equity, vulnerable groups and minorities, etc., indigenous people, disability, undocumented immigrants, so illegal immigrants, and people discriminated against on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And next, it just straight up says the principle of equity remains fundamental to sustainable development. And I mean, equity is equality of outcome. This is pure Marxist communism. And so this is what the United Nations aims to achieve. Peterson says, oh, I rewrote this document to strip it of its ideological claptrap. But I mean, all of this remains in the document. All of this talk about creating equity between different groups in every country on Earth. So, if anything, he went in and removed the language that made it seem too overtly communist to help disguise it so that it wasn't as bad as it was. I mean, can you imagine how bad it would have been? Can you imagine how bad it must have been before they paid Jordan Peterson to come in and rewrite this document so it didn't seem as obviously communist? And look at this. It starts talking about social equity and carbon prices. It says, so on page 51, it says, social equity is a key element of the scheme which provides support to low-income households to assist with the impact of the carbon price. So here they're actually using climate change as justification for socialist redistribution of wealth from the wealthier people in society to the low-income people in society, such as the illegal immigrants that they already mentioned earlier in the document as being in need of this. Here's where things start getting really scary on page 68. It says equity both between and within countries is central to sustainable development. What does it mean to create equality of outcome between countries? Well, what this is saying is they want to transfer wealth between countries from the wealthier countries, aka the Western world, into the third world. And they believe that this is going to have a positive impact on climate change. That's their justification for doing this. Then on page 71, the panel calls for a process to explore the concept and application of the critical issue of equity in relation to sustainable development. So there you have it. This document that Jordan Peterson rewrote to strip it of the ideological claptrap is a Marxist, one world government, communist white paper. It's a blueprint for how the United Nations intends to redistribute the wealth from first world nations, not only to third world countries, but also to illegal immigrants who come into first world countries. Because remember, they said they want to create equity between regular citizens and illegal immigrants too. So yeah, why is it that when Jordan Peterson brings up his time at the United Nations and he brings up this paper he worked on, he never ever talks about the fact that it's a Marxist one world government blueprint. He only talks about how, oh, he thinks that, maybe some of the conclusions they came to about, the state of the environment aren't quite as bad as it is in reality. You never hear him expose this. You never hear him talk about this. Frankly, it's obviously because he wants to help them achieve this.
I think the vast majority, for example, of entrepreneurs in the United States come from the Indian subcontinent. So great, bring them over. They're highly educated, they're extraordinarily productive, they make lots of new businesses, and then they pump money like mad back into India. Good deal.
Nationalism is the largest obstacle these globalists have to overcome to implement their vision for global communist hegemony. Naturally, Jordan Peterson decries nationalism as a reprehensible evil that must be abolished, taking exceptional issue with nationalism in the Western world that would prevent globalists from flooding our countries with migrants.
I don't think that the Caucasians, let's say, should revert to being white. I think that's a bad idea. It's a dangerous idea, and it's coming fast. And I don't like to see that.
And then that's celebrated, say, on the radical right. Say, well, okay, well, if we're going to devolve into tribalism, then we'll triumphantly herald our past accomplishments and unite under the flag of our race and blood. But we know what happens when that happens. It's not pretty.